Warm welcome to everybody for this webinar on the economics of happiness. Is it ready for serious cost-benefit analysis? And before we begin, let me acknowledge that we are hosting this in Montreal here from unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation are the traditional custodians of the lands and waters where I live and work, and they're still here, and there's much reconciliation to be done. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us on behalf of the Canadian Wellbeing Knowledge Network, as well as the School of Population and Global Health at McGill, as well as CIRIC, which organizes a lot of the economics conferences in Montreal. My name is Chris Barrington-Leigh, and I'm the academic principal investigator of the Canadian Wellbeing Knowledge Network, or CWKN, but it's led by a collective. And my partner in this work at McGill is Jennifer Proudfoot, who is here and will help me with synthesizing your questions for the latter portion of today's event. We have three wise speakers today, and without labeling anyone, I'd like to point out that the CWKN has much more diversity than you might see represented on your screen today, and I apologize for that. We have a very specific topic today which brings these speakers together. So our plan is to have each speaker say a few words of introduction about WALYs and WELLBYs and the work in Canada's central government on wellbeing evaluation and their quality of life framework. And then we'll go into a discussion for the majority of the time. And we'll finish promptly by 1:30. Les présentations seront tous en anglais, mais les questions dans le chat seront bienvenues en français, évidemment. So you can make comments and submit questions anytime you like in the chat, and I'll be trying to synthesize those, as I said, with Jen's help, and we'll come to them increasingly throughout the discussion. Let me introduce our speakers in reverse order. First of all, we have Craig Joyce. Craig has been at the forefront of Canada's federal government's Quality of Life initiative, first at the Privy Council office, and then in the Department of Finance, and now as a unit head at Statistics Canada. In addition to helping lead the development of the Federal Quality of Life Framework, which was released with the budget in 2021, Craig has a particular interest in subjective well-being and its uses for policy, which he's been putting to use since even before all those other positions, when he worked at the Public Health Agency of Canada in the area of healthy living and chronic disease prevention. Craig is here, it should be said, as an individual, and he is not speaking on behalf of the government. Next, we have Michael Birkjær. Let me now, who is a senior analyst at the Happiness Research Institute based in Copenhagen. There, the focus of his expertise is on how happiness research can be used to assess societal programs, the impact of digital technology and the quality of healthcare, as well as on how well-being metrics can guide both private and public decision-making. In 2020, Michael co-authored a handbook called Wellbeing Adjusted Life Years, a universal metric to quantify the happiness return on investment, published by the Happiness Research Institute. Michael holds an MSc in political science from the University of Copenhagen and speaks frequently on happiness and well-being economies and how subjective well-being measures can inform improved decision-making and impact investment. And third, we have Paul Frijters. Paul is a prominent research economist and a truly prolific scholar. His interests and contributions are also extremely broad, but among his countless publications are some of the most cited papers in the economics of well-being. Paul started his education at the University of Groningen, in case you want to place his accent, and he's held positions at many major universities, including 4 in Australia, where in 2009 he was voted Australia's best young economist under 40 by the Australian Economic Society. As well as his academic side, Paul has a long history of policy engagement. He's a regular blogger, and he's not afraid of speaking out against the dominant narrative, most recently about how misguided COVID policies have been. That actually relates to today's topic, but we're not going to spend much time talking about COVID per se. Last year, he published 2 books. One of them was about COVID, and the other, with Christian Krekel, is entitled A Handbook for Wellbeing Policymaking, History, Theory, Measurement, Implementation, and Examples. And that book has now actually been released for free, and I think it's a labor of love as well as of insight. So we are honored and grateful to have each of you sharing your perspective with us today. Paul, please take it away, and maybe you can make sure to include a little bit of definition of terms when it comes to measuring well-being or happiness.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Bonsoir. Le français est un peu difficile pour moi, mais ça va avec la question, j'espère. The opening remark I want to start with is that many Western governments, and I believe the Canadian as well, have essentially mandated cost-benefit analyses. And this started in the Reagan period in the US and since then spread over the Western world. So cost-benefit analyses are a part of how government is done. And hence, major programs have to be costed and go through a treasury process in many cases, whereby the people who advocate them have to make a reasonable case that the benefits outweigh the cost on some metric. And so the name of the game is, well, what metrics are better? And it used to be the case that we looked at economic surplus as the measure. That's the measure still dominant in most countries. And the people who advocate well-being, by that we're going to mean life satisfaction. I'll explain that a little bit later. Basically say, look, there's a better metric which captures more of what is of value. And so to just sketch what the cost-benefit people do in this world, they estimate how some sort of major change will change all kinds of outcomes. Then they try to price each of those changes in the outcomes, and they preferably look for market prices or willingness to pay. So how much would you be willing to pay for, let's say, a new park or for reducing crime? And then you tally up all the benefits that you anticipate of some policy, and you compare that with the costs, and you can do things with it. You can do one minus the other, net present value. You can divide one by the other, cost benefit or cost effectiveness. And so it's an attempt at becoming rational. It's not perfect. There's a lot of crystal ball glazing involved in cost-benefit analyses, even though it's well over a century old. There's a lot of things you can hate about it, but it's deemed better than not making an effort at all to sort of try and get on top of costs and benefits. So it's often the name of the game is to get a reasonable ballpark figure. And the practices differ, right? Now, just to convince you that this sort of thing is truly done, this is a cost-benefit analysis done by the UK Department of Transport, and this is what it looks like, right? It's got various areas, and then they come to numbers, and this was for extending Heathrow, so you're looking at things to do with runways, and so you're looking at producer surplus, which would then be changes in the profits of airlines. You're looking at air quality, because of course airplanes make things dirty. You're looking at noise. You're looking at wider economic impacts and all that kind of thing. And so then you have an NPV, net social benefits, and you also have things that they don't manage to monetize, and they're sort of put in sort of green and red. And of course, the takeaway point is that when this arrives in Parliament, all that remains of all that effort is basically a number, and everything that was not monetized is basically deemed to no longer be important. So the basic rule of that is that if you can't count it, it doesn't count. Right, in both politics and in the bureaucracy. And this is where most of the sustainable development goals die. Effectively, they're not counted in modern cost-benefit analyses, and so they don't exist. And the same goes for lots of things of social value, friendships, marriages, new babies, loneliness, mental health. They basically have an extremely low value, if they have value at all, in existing practice. So we want to do better than that, right? We want to include the things that people really value, and there are other reasons for them as well. Okay, so dominant CBA analyses do bad on social life, mental health, and the environment, because they make life easy for the analysts by presuming they have no value. And hence note that the social development goals measured via maybe 900 odd individual indicators around the world go and die at this stage of the bureaucratic machinery. And an alternative is to say that governments want to maximize happy years lived. And if you do that, then you can value anything for which you have a reasonable notion of how important they are for happiness. And so then you're in the game of valuing the length of life and the quality of life. And by quality of life, we then have a subjective well-being measure in mind. Subjective in the sense that individuals themselves choose it, And that, of course, concords with the democratic idea that people know what's important to them in life. And so the idea of the WELLBY is that you base everything of a metric, and the metric is a subjective question. So imagine yourself answering the question overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? 0 is not at all, and a 10 completely. This is the life satisfaction question, the various versions of it. This particular one is mandated in all major UK government surveys since 2011, and a WELLBY is defined off it. It's 1 unit of life satisfaction on a 0 to 10 scale for one person for 1 year. It's a flow measure. We know an awful lot about this. You should think that there are something like 200,000 studies since the 1930s on this question, or things very close to it. And so this is one of the most studied questions in social science. We know that somebody who's very healthy is about an 8. We know that somebody indifferent to deaf is probably around a 2. And that means that the difference between an 8 and a 2 is how much a year of life is worth, namely 6 WELLBYs. The UK Treasury says it's 7 WELLBYs. And we also have a notion of, well, how much does a government have to pay in order to produce 1 WELLBY via its normal programs? And I would put that figure more at sort of £4,000 to £6,000, and the UK Treasury puts it at £10,000. What do you then do in CBAs? Well, you're sort of maximizing a discounted flow of these life satisfaction surpluses, the WELLBYs. But of course, you don't truly calculate that flow. For every policy, you try and work out what the change would be. You work out, well, which groups are going to change their life satisfaction of, how much longer are they going to live, and that is standard in existing cost-benefit analysis as well. But you have a huge price list available, and I know that this is also what Michael Birkjær will talk about. So the CBA calculations, you're still crystal ball gazing about changes in outcomes on various dimensions, but you have different prices in mind. You now have well-being prices in mind, and you can also convert government money into WELLBYs. And so because it's much easier to value social life, environment, and mental health in this, they start to have a lot greater weight in policy. You can also do well-being cost effectiveness, and this graph just tells you that there's been a lot of work done over the last couple of years to get some idea as to the ballpark value of things like even the Olympics, mental health programs, also things like normal medicines, housing for homelessness, US health insurance, and various other things. So we're here looking at a world in which we're starting to use life satisfaction as the anchoring for the quality of life, and channeling both economic, social, environmental, and internal mental goods into this single metric in order to make them all trade-offable against each other. And I think that's where I leave this introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Michael, can I ask you to take us onward?
Yes, I'll just share my screen just 1 second. Great. So yeah, I'm actually going to repeat a few things that Paul has already said. I think it's worth repeating. I think we are very aligned on many of the problems with conventional methods. I also have some different things I wanted to touch upon about the problems that differ a little bit, and our solution also have a little bit of difference to it. So I'm going to talk about WALY, which is just another acronym for Wellbeing Adjusted Life Years, but I think it's worth to also emphasize that WALY and WELLBY has its differences. So the first insight I would like to introduce is that cost-benefit analysis consists of like budgetary values and social values, and this is like there's a lot of terminology confusion in economics in general. This is how I like to put it, and it's basically some of the same things as Paul said. So we deal with, whenever you do a cost-benefit analysis, there are some values that are pure budgetary, and there are some that are more social in essence. So when we're looking at like public decision-making, public spending, public decision-making, the budgetary values seems to cover, of course, when we talk about costs, like it's public expenditures, and the benefits are public savings, tax income, and so on. So everything that goes in and out of the public purse, so to say. And you will, of course, want to include them into your cost-benefit analysis. That makes perfect sense. But in many cases, it just doesn't suffice. It doesn't capture everything that really matters for our society and for welfare. So it is already very acknowledged that we want to look at like some valuations on non-market goods and other welfare elements, such as the good life and health and death, that we want to attribute some value. And that's very common. And I think Paul has already addressed some of the problems with these metrics. I'm going to address some others, but I also just want to tell, like, so basically I come from a position where we've also worked a lot with like philanthropic impact investors, and they are at a kind of similar spot. So they of course also work with a lot of like budgetary values when they conduct investments and do due diligence, and of course it's just return on investment that's their primary tool in a lot of ways. But they are more and more also interested in showing their impact in a more social way and leaning on measures like the SDG, ESG, CSR, and so on, which also has a lot of issues that, and my argument is that WALY actually, or WELLBY, can resolve some of these issues for both public and private decision makers. Again, I want to emphasize that many of the things that Paul said, and I think like the problems with willingness to pay is one of the main issues with some of the conventional metrics, that we rely on people's opinions often in when we value goods, and WELLBY and WALY takes it into another direction. I think that's a really, really core concept to be aware of. Another thing that's just important to say is that whenever we do a cost-benefit analysis, the budgetary values are, of course, always expressed in monetary values, but the social values can be expressed in raw values, but also at times monetized. My insight too, second thing I want to highlight is that the conventional models have some clear limitations beyond what Paul have already addressed. I have 3 points that I think is really important, and it's really important to a lot of the work we do at the Happiness Research Institute. The first one is the comparability issue. So basically, many of these conventional social valuation methods are rather incommensurable. Like, they can be put into the same like equation. You can monetize them and just then assume that it works, but it is really not that meaningful to start you doing a cost-benefit analysis and both implementing qualities and value of statistical life and all sorts of things, and then just believing that they are comparable and they are commensurable. They are not, and there's a big problem in doing so. So in general, we actually do not have, until more recently, a common currency that can inform us about the proportional value loss across sectors when we are talking. So we haven't really had like a measure that can tell us whether we are like, whether loneliness is worse than like air pollution. And it's not that we need to like compare everything all the time, but it's important in the sense that we need to know whether there are some things that are in a proportional sense underinvested, or we have like we underinvest into it in a relative sense. So we need a common currency, but another thing that's also very important, and also something Paul touched upon, is that the like effective social policies are generally undervalued. Like stuff like loneliness and homelessness and these kinds of things are not valued because we don't have like a good social value for these things, which is really ironic. But it's also very problematic, and it actually generates kind of a structural problem, because in many other sectors we do have some social values. Even though they are poor, they are there. But in the social sphere and the social sector, we are just relying on budgetary valuations, and that is creating an undervaluation of the effective social policies in the great scheme of things. Lastly, but not least, the conventional models, they cannot address wicked problems, and many of the problems we are facing today are the so-called wicked problems. And wicked problems are defined as the problems that by nature have several phases and needs to be addressed by several sectors. So, for instance, homelessness is not like just a social problem. It's a problem that relates to employment. It relates to health, psychiatry, all sorts of things. And when we have when all of these sectors, they have different valuation methods, it gets really, really hard to communicate and to know how valuable the different interventions are. So I think there's really a need for also finding some common ground there in order to start addressing the wicked problems in a proper way. So this is actually what we're arguing, like WELLBY or WALY really serves as a good common currency for impact across various domains. And yeah, so we have worked with WALY since 2018, published our report in 2020, and it's it basically the way we find it is that WALY is 1 year lived in potential well-being. And just to take it quickly through how we actually measure it, we basically look at test groups, like an affected group that could be people who have a disease, and then we compare it to like a happy counterpart, which is basically the control group. And we look at the life satisfaction difference between the two groups and find like the difference, which can here be expressed in like in a relative term. And that is what WALY does. It expresses them in relative terms. So depression reduce your well-being by 17%, unemployment 9%, diabetes 4%. And these values can then be elicited from RCTs, course experiments, and different types of methodologies. Of course, the better the study, the more we should put weight on that coefficient. And then what you get in the end is basically like an evaluation where you can say what it, like in this case, for instance, occupation, where employment in an occupation that is below, just I need to be able to read it, that is below an individual skill or work experience, we can see, we can see that people who are affected by this, they lose 0.28 life satisfaction on average. And that's actually the WELLBY value, right? And so what we just do that's different is that we change that into a relative coefficient. So that's what you see on the right. So we basically say, what is that relative to where they came from or relative to the happy counterpart? And that is a different value you get out of that. That's 0.034, like so 3.4%. And that has some implications, these two different formats. And I think we can discuss that in more detail when we start the discussion. So that's all from me.
Thank you very much, Michael. Craig.
Hi, and thanks for including me on the panel. I don't have too many slides to share. I might flash one a little bit later in my comments, but I wanted to just sort of pick up on some of the themes that Paul and Michael have touched on. So in Chris's introduction to me, like he noted sort of I've been a bit transient through government and worked in a number of different roles. And some of the, I guess the theme sort of running through all of those roles has been subjective well-being, quality of life, and trying to sort of find ways to glean insight from that evidence to sort of inform policy and decision-making in a variety of different ways. And I think as I've kind of moved through those roles, I think I see myself at sort of the intersection between a couple different schools of thought on this. So there's the sort of the happiness-based sort of WELLBY, WALY sort of approach that we're here to kind of talk about today. But then there's another approach around building frameworks for multidimensional sort of thinking about complex policy issues. And that's kind of been sort of more the theme of the more recent years of the work that I've been doing. So I became really interested in this happiness-based side back in my days in public health for a lot of the reasons that Michael actually just sort of raised in his own remarks. That is an area I was working in particular around the prevention of chronic disease and promotion of healthy lifestyles. So social policy, it is an area that is very hard to demonstrate impact in, for one, and also to kind of value in quantitative ways and show sort of good return on investment. A lot of the outcome that you achieve in those type of programs is social and difficult to quantify in the ways that Michael in particular just described. And what was happening at the time I was working there kind of around that policy context was a real push around impact investing and sort of shared sort of funding models between public and private sources. And so there was a real drive to sort of create business cases for social investment in the area of public health. And we did not really have kind of great models for doing that. And what we saw were a lot of not-for-profit organizations sort of picking up on this desire of government to sort of partner with the private sector to find additional sources of funds for these sorts of things. And they were looking to this discussion around things like social return on investment and that sort of thing to sort of demonstrate sort of the impact that they had with the kind of interventions that they had to attract these alternate sources of funding. But I have to say, I found that whole sort of discussion around social return like a little bit impoverished, or maybe a lot impoverished, in terms of the methods that it employed to understand sort of what the actual value of these things were. It felt a little bit too back of the envelope and sometimes almost amateurish, if I can say, and wasn't really benefiting from kind of best practice in this area. So that's where I sort of came sort of across this sort of notion of WELLBYs and WALYs. And we did some work around valuing social outcomes that we might expect from the types of programs that we had. So in our case, it was a behavioral health program. We were looking at things like, what is the value of an increase in someone's level of physical activity, like beyond sort of these long-term sort of disease prevention outcomes that we theorize will happen over the course of someone's life. What happens to people when they become more physically active? And it seems to me at the time that, anecdotally, if you know people that sort of make changes to their lifestyle and they sort of improve their own health in that way, they will tell you that they feel better, right? Like they have this sort of innate sense that their life is subjectively better from these sorts of things. And so we were kind of intrigued to sort of get a sense of like, how can we kind of quantify that and sort of bring that onto the balance sheet? Because that does seem like something that really matters to people. And so that's what sort of brings in sort of the happiness side. But there's this other sort of approach around multidimensional sort of frameworks for decision making. I might try to share my screen here. And my more recent work has been around this. So coming out of the last recession, there was the Stiglitz report. Many people, I think, on this call would have heard of this. And some of the key recommendations out of that were that we should be, as government decision makers, thinking more sort of in a more multidimensional way about sort of what makes for good quality of life, and think more holistically about how we make decisions. And so that is kind of what influenced the OECD Better Life Index. And you can sort of see sort of a cascading sort of effect across the OECD family of nations, in particular, of different countries sort of putting together these frameworks. New Zealand's Wellbeing budget, and Canada released its own in budget 2021. So that's what I was doing at the Department of Finance over the last couple of years. So there was a world in which, like, where we could have done this as a sort of happiness-based type thing, like where we started with life satisfaction and determined what the sort of determinants of that were. That's not quite what this is. So we include a mix of sort of subjective and objective indicators in here. It kind of overlaps with that worldview, but it really is kind of like a framework of indicators that various policymakers have agreed are things that contribute to good quality of life in Canada. So in total, it adds up to about 84 indicators, which includes life satisfaction. But it doesn't necessarily sort of center that as sort of like its core. So there is this kind of tension between sort of this happiness-based approach and the multidimensional sort of based approach, and what is the right one to take in government. It seems to me that this one that you're kind of seeing on the screen has a little bit more appeal among certain sort of circles than the happiness-based approach, but I'm sure that's something that we'll kind of come back to when we discuss through the question. So I might leave my sort of opening remarks there and see where the discussion goes. But I hope that kind of gives you a bit of context around sort of what I can bring to the panel and sort of the perspective I have on some of these issues.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Craig. So, I mean, there are so many questions to ask, probing into, some of the details of differences and what stage these things are at. But I actually want to start stepping back a little bit and just, to what extent are governments actually doing cost-benefit analysis all by conventional means, right? So we've heard from Craig about value of exercise as an example. I think Paul mentioned the UK Green Book, which is in government and putting numbers on some of this stuff from a life satisfaction approach. But where does life satisfaction or quantitative frameworks like the quality of life framework that is presumably meant to guide decision making and presumably substitute whatever is happening now with something better, where does this kind of quantitative decision making to what extent is it even there in the first place, right? So are we replacing something, or is this also a matter of rationalizing decisions in government in a way that hasn't even happened before? And so my question's becoming too long maybe, but where does this also fit in the broader ecosystem of decision-making processes in government? Paul wants to start us off. Thank you.
Yes, a very important question, Chris. I think that, to be fair, there are many types of decision processes taken here, right? Politicians often decide things on the basis of pressure from voters, pressures from all kinds of interest groups, and they have no care in those situations for either good life indicators, life satisfaction, sustainable development goals. It's much more mundane, if you like. And so the world in which cost-benefit analysis are taken more seriously are sort of, the core of the nation states, the deep states, if you like, the departments of finance, who are trying to use cost-benefit analysis to bring some rationality to spending programs inside the major spending departments. That is a subset of all decisions, not all decisions at all, but it is a subset of decisions. But they are trying to make that mandatory, particularly in Whitehall bureaucracies. So the UK, New Zealand, Victoria, and Australia, probably Canada, which I know less. But cost-benefit analysis are used throughout the OECD as a mandatory aspect of many government decisions. It doesn't mean they're always done, and it doesn't mean that they're taken seriously, because at the end of the day, the politicians decide. And of course, there are other mechanisms rather than this sort of, long-term view of what should we do for society. And the other mechanisms could be just what voters want, or where other pressure comes from on politicians, including things like an emergency, in which case often we go with the gut feeling of all kinds of people. But I do think that this is a long-run attractor. Right? The long-run attractor is to try to become more rational, to try to do your best to put it all on a single metric, which allows you to do trade-offs. The great difficulty of having something with 80 or 300 or 500 indicators is that you got no idea where the trade-offs come from. And also, there's not really the background research to tell you how any particular policy affects all those outcomes. So effectively, you're then in the world of a huge degree of discretion, and that is seen as very problematic by spending units. So they try to get away from that multidimensional world. They think it's unworkable, but politicians often like discretion. So there's definitely a trade-off there.
Oops. Michael?
Yeah. So I just wanted to add that I like it from at least from a Danish perspective, like cost-benefit analysis does take up a little, like it is a big thing. And on some cost-benefit analysis, at least in the public, is conducted in a more like automated way. So for instance, we have like the medical council in Denmark who decides which kind of health technologies are getting implemented and getting market access, and they use the WALY all the time to like just figure out what drugs and health technologies need and treatments need to get on the market, so the patients can access it. And then there are like more comprehensive commissions that are sometimes established and where they to calculate like is a bigger reform in society and whether it is impactful or not. Like, so in Denmark recently, a few years ago, we had like a big commission that tried to estimate whether it would be smart to tax fossil fuel cars to make it more attractable to drive like a electric car, and there that's called massive cost benefit analysis, where they put like a value on CO2 reduction. They measure like what is all the economic expenditures and savings and from doing this. But in the end, what actually ended up being the most determining variable in that whole cost benefit analysis was a social value, where they said like, let's figure out. They basically used the willingness to pay analysis and asked the people in the population how willing they are to pay an electric car versus a fossil fuel car, and it was like a very outdated study they used. So all of a sudden, it just looked very, very, very cost inefficient. Like it was very costly to actually implement this solution. Where we would probably, from a WALY perspective, see that driving a fossil fuel car versus electric car really doesn't matter that much, and if it does, it's probably marginal. So that you wouldn't see like those billions of Danish crowns in costs that we did see with the stated preference, the willingness to pay analysis. So and that just meant it was rejected, right? So it really, really matters which valuations we pick, and we just can't not question these valuations. And so that's my take on it. And just like, I think a second comment in terms of where does it fit into the whole like ecosystem, these cost benefit analysis, and a bit to Craig's point, I think it's very important to say that I think, at least in my view, WALY or WELLBY or life satisfaction should not like just be a single measure that replace everything and replace GDP, and it's just it's too single to do all those things. So like having a dashboard of metrics makes sense when we are talking about like national strategies, when we are talking about priorities and so on. But in the end, often, decisions needs to be made. We need to figure out how to allocate resources, and in that case, dashboards doesn't work because we can't value them against each other. So we do need to either go like with willingness to pay analysis or WELLBY or WALY. Like that's kind of the options we have at hand to start valuing these things against each other. And I think that's really, really important to emphasize that it's really hard to do without cost benefit analysis when we have to make decisions.
Okay, I think I've got a number of questions that might go deeper on this topic, and I sense also maybe that we have some differences here. But in some sense, Craig, I'm not entirely satisfied with the answers from Paul and Michael, because I understand, so governments use cost benefit analysis for some stuff. We can give examples, but the question is to what extent. This is maybe it doesn't make sense to quantify, but how much of decisions in governments are rationalized now in some quantitative way like this, and I guess I'll have follow-up questions maybe to get at that more and to think about where we're going and to assess the depth of the potential we're talking about. But Craig, can you add anything on this question of to what extent are people in government sitting there optimizing in order to make decisions at the moment?
I mean, probably not as much as you might hope. My read of your question is more like, what's the culture around sort of policy making? Like, is it inclusive of cost benefit type thinking? And like Paul's mentioned, like it's mandated in Canada. That's technically true for like regulatory policy. We do have some longstanding requirements around cost benefit analysis of those. I don't know that much about that. I've never really worked in regulatory policy. If it's done, it's probably done in a very traditional way in kind of a back room somewhere. I think that there are a lot of folks who, when introduced to sort of the idea of like cost benefit or return on investment or like maximizing value for money, that sort of thing, are interested in that, but don't really know how to get there. I would say on our like the evaluation side of things, I'm not sure how mature we are in terms of just some basic things that we would need to do before we even got to cost benefit analysis. So for example, just the notion of experimentation, experimental design to support a cost benefit sort of analysis of a policy intervention. I think we have a lot to do even there in Canada. So I think there are a lot of ambitions, but I'm not sure that we're really there. When I think about the UK, it strikes me as a more, and this may not be true, but as an outsider looking at it, strikes me as a more sort of open, because they have their Treasury guidelines, which are very specific about cost benefit and includes the sort of WELLBY approach within it. It seems like they have more of an advanced sort of culture around that than we do in Canada, but I would say we're not as focused on it as perhaps some of us might like to be.
By the way, there's just three of us, so I would say we can, three of you, jump in whenever you like. Can I just actually before we dive a little bit more into this, can we step back and talk about the audience for this kind of work? Who are the different audiences for these kind of, if we're talking about frameworks and tools and maybe databases, for whom might there be something, who should be paying attention, for whom might there be something practical to use here, and maybe when? And then maybe we're going to end up talking more about central governments after giving that perspective.
Yeah, maybe I can start on that, because in the UK, that audience is remarkably diverse and big. So in the UK, there's the State of Life charity. I would encourage you to check them out. They basically made a simple WELLBY cost-benefit analysis tool for all kinds of small charities, local football clubs, churches. They bring out thousands of clients. So it's being used as an experimental tool by businesses, corporations, charities, semi-government. And so you'd be surprised. Basically, anybody who's sort of truly serious about the well-being of some group can do some of this in a fairly simple manner. So the potential is huge and is definitely being taken up in the UK. Now, in other countries, I totally agree with what Greg just said, basically, right? Which is that, yes, this is sort of bigger in the UK, but here too, of course, politics rules the roost at the end of the day. So the major initial audience is inside the bureaucracy, but there's a growing and active interest in charity land.
I think it really depends in terms of what use for it do you have in mind. I see it as sort of on both ends of the policy cycle. So in terms of setting priorities and understanding sort of where investments could be made, I think the intended audience there is sort of more center of government, central sort of planning, budgeting, priority setting, maybe even cabinet, those types of audiences. On the other end, which is sort of where I consider myself to have more experience around sort of the evaluation and the demonstration of value and sort of the building of evidence around what works and sort of understanding sort of what types of interventions might be sort of more desirable relative to others. That I see as sort of more in the program delivery kind of zone, the program managers. But the social sector, so not-for-profits and that sort of thing, there's a huge appetite for that kind of thinking in that sector, I think, in Canada and beyond. You hear a lot of NGOs and charities and things talking about this kind of thing, but not really having the resources or skill sets to sort of do it on their own. So,
Michael, yeah.
Yeah, I just agree, and it's my own experience as well. Like that, social enterprises, NGOs, like the whole social sector, there's a massive interest in this, basically to be able to demonstrate the social impact these organizations has in society, which is just something we haven't really done that well previously, and that's also what I experienced in Denmark. Massive interest from these types of stakeholders, organizations, but also so I've been working a lot with philanthropy and impact investors, also in life science. One of our biggest partners is an impact investor in life science, a German one, and so there's also a big interest from that side because they struggle with, so it's a bit different than public policies, but as I mentioned in my presentation, they also struggle with similar things when because of the ESG measures and and CSR measures that they can use, they are also a bit, to use the same word as Craig, amateurish, and they're not that empirical, and there's a lot of question, a lot of mistrust, and so there's also a big interest in what can these approaches, what can these well-being approaches actually offer. So yeah, I think it's a really, really broad audience we are looking at.
Thanks. I want to try and get at this another way, and I think maybe we'll talk later about pathways from here to there. But I actually just want to hear from you each, because we're all passionate about this. You're all passionate about this the version of this stuff that you're working on, paint me a picture of 50 years or whatever it is from now in terms of where this is headed. What is the ideal? What's the vision? And that mostly means, well, it means two things. One is, how much is it permeating decision making in these domains we're talking about, and the other is as speculative, more speculative maybe even, is how much would society be transformed by following this thread? So what's the vision that you have in mind that you're working towards? Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, well, at least one clear implication of let's say we adopted this and governments adopted it, and we basically got like a WELLBY or WALY market, so to say. Like, I think one of the clearest implications to me, just looking at the evidence, is that many of these social policies, and I'm maybe just repeating myself now, but they will start to gain more. We will start to emphasize their importance much more than we are currently doing. When you look across all of the evidence in subjective well-being research, like, there's nothing like loneliness and social problems that are causing more misery and suffering. You can compare, like, for the general population, like loneliness, for instance, is a massive problem, and it's really destroying lives, but it just has no value in no cost benefit analysis, and it's not right that we can value all sorts of other things, but some of the things that are most important to people, I think we need to remember, like, people are social beings, perhaps first and foremost, and that really needs to be acknowledged in our decision making as well. And I think that is what we will see then if we adopted metrics like this in a broader way. Social policies will start to gain traction. We would reallocate way more resources into, like, solutions, interventions, tackling loneliness and related problems.
Paul first, go ahead.
Yes, let me try and sketch this. You ask a big question, right? 50 years from now. Well, if we're asking my utopia, then this stuff would become the normal way that governments behave, but also the normal way that households, individuals, firms, communities, families, and large corporations would work. So they would basically judge themselves on how much well-being that they create for the rest of society and indeed the rest of the world. I think that would transform what we find important in societies. We would much more than now value emotional intelligence, relationship skills very early on in life, very much less value materialistic outcomes. Governments and society would see status as inevitable, but definitely as a molding tool to sort of guide people towards behavior that is good for the rest of the group rather than parasites on the rest of the group. I think also inside government, we would see a sort of a ruthless reimagining of both what is important and what their real tools are. So their tools will not just be status in education, but also identity ecosystems. Right? We would look very differently at the notion of identity and far more see that as a whole miasma of changing groups that ultimately are just well-being deliverers. I think elections will be fought on this. And teaching in subjective well-being would be standard then in high school, so the people are essentially told what is most important for other people in life in order to reach a happy life, and also to, as it were, prepare them for the normalcy of being oriented towards doing well in this realm.
So I guess that leaves me, I would jump in with my own utopian vision, which would be that if this kind of thinking were to take hold in a meaningful way at scale in the policy cycle in some way, it would lead to greater investment in prevention. I think that there's really nothing that shines a light on the value of preventive policy more than the WELLBY and WALY approach. I think that it really does quantify the social value of interventions, which gets ignored, and sometimes can actually be more impactful than the thing that people think they're doing in their intervention, right? Like, I have a couple papers out, one of which points to an example of a skills training program, and it wasn't the employment benefits which were the intended outcome of that intervention, which were the largest impacts. It was really these more sort of intangible social things of people having a sense of community and connection and that sort of thing. So that all seems sort of like rainbows and butterflies, but these things actually really do have a measurable sort of impact on people, but we do ignore them, and it does make those types of social policies seem less attractive than they really are, because they do add a lot of quality to life. And I think, well, I'll stop there. We'll probably touch on other things. I don't want to ramble on too long.
Okay. Rapid fire. The well-being should be the primary goal of government. Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay. And when you say yes, of course, is that still a radical notion?
Yes.
It depends. Do you mean happiness and life satisfaction? Then I would say yes, that continues to be controversial. Yeah.
Okay. So I actually want to ask you about the reception then in a moment. But first, following on this vision, there's this long-term vision. Now let's bring it back to reality. And I could ask, are we actually ready to be peddling this stuff now? So if we're talking about, databases of coefficients of regression and study results, or weights on a quality of life framework, whatever it is, that's a lot of knowledge, and it's also, there may be a gap between the kind of stuff that is measured that we know now that are in those databases, to the extent they exist, and the kind of decisions that policymakers are actually needing to make. And so the question is, to what extent is this stuff actionable now? How big is the gap in terms of, how close are we to actually, usability?
Maybe I can go on that. I think in many areas it's used now and it's usable now. I think at the local level for self-experimentation, self-exploration, and improvement of what charities do and corporations, it's not just ready, it's used, right? And it's used in a big scale. I think for many policy areas also, it's ready and used, certainly in the UK. But in some areas, we're a long way off, right? We're a long way off lists that governments maintain that they believe in. We're a long way off the civil service being trained enough in this to be usable, a long way off politicians thinking in terms of how they can sell this to voters, or to sort of be ready for some of the major battles that they would have to undertake with the groups that would lose out. So in some ways we're there, in other ways we're at the start of the mountain.
Craig?
I think I would agree with all of that and maybe add some nuance of where I think adoption has been slower has been on that ex ante priority setting, needs identification, sort of resource allocation end of things. Like where there has been momentum and progress made, it tends to be more on the back end, demonstrating value, evaluating, building evidence. That seems safer to folks, and that can be kind of managed, as Paul says, at local levels or kind of within ministries or not-for-profits. Like they can do that on their own. They don't need permission to do that. And there seems to be like just growing demand for that. Like I think, especially in the social sector, people get it and they understand the value of that. Where, having worked on sort of like the budgeting end as well, like it's a tougher sell there. Politicians don't seem to want to, and maybe for good reasons, maybe for bad reasons, I won't prejudge, cede decision-making territory to something that might seem kind of technocratic to them. So they don't necessarily, they want evidence-based decision-making. They don't want evidence-determined decision-making. They want some sort of leeway to sort of choose what those priorities might be. And I think that where we run into trouble with the subjective well-being stuff is that they see it as deterministic and not leaving them a lot of room to make decisions, that it kind of points to the path they should take, and that there's no judgment left for them to take there. And I think that's where I think that's one of the things that makes people suspicious about it. I'm kind of trying to read tea leaves here because I'm not quite sure why we haven't had as much momentum on that end as we might have liked by now, but there is resistance there, and that's, I think, part of it.
Michael, do you want to jump in first? We'll come back to Paul.
It's just a quick notion, because I basically agree with everything Craig and Paul said. I think just if there should be like a point of optimism here, or more optimism, it may be that we could face some acceleration of recognition in this because of the state of our like mental health in the population that seems to be decreasing, and there's like a lot of interest in this. And just thinking about my own career, and like when I started at the Happiness Research Institute, and we talked about well-being and policymaking, people had a reference to Bhutan, and I think that was it. And it was definitely not as acknowledged and respected as it is now. And it's just something that happened within very, very few years. Like, so there's a real, the acceleration of this is quite impressive in my view. And I think it's just much easier within a year to have conversations with both public and private like stakeholders in public or private organizations now about this. There's a much better reception. So I think maybe we are also looking into some acceleration there, hopefully, even though it's because of some sad statistics.
Okay, Paul.
I just wanted to sort of say I completely agree with Craig that politicians dislike we're having space taken away, and in that sense, they, as it were, channel the opinions and the intuition they and their voters have, which is often not really aligned yet with the relative magnitudes that we find in social well-being research. So I see that very much as something that will only change slowly, right, as the population gets used to thinking in this way, but also sort of reevaluates for themselves. Yes, maybe we should think of loneliness as actually much more important than our next Ferrari, right? Yeah, and to become self-convinced of that, and I think that just takes time.
Okay, I want to stay on this for a moment, because I think, as Paul hinted here, it's not just the decision makers, the politicians, as Craig mentioned, that are skeptical along these lines. The average person has some of the same reactions. On the role of democracy and voting in ultimately government decision making, Paul has written that the population as a whole might not know how to improve their well-being. And Paul, you've also spoken about the benefit of what you call experience goods, which are essentially things that people are skeptical of until they've been taught a skill or experienced the good. So can you speak a little bit more about how democracy-loving citizens should feel about this? There's both a technocratic element and a paternalism, and those are both threatening aspects of this whole area.
Yes, well, I'm definitely democracy-loving myself, and so the way I envisage this is that there must, as it were, be room on the basis of persuasion, and that indeed can go for things that are experienced. So let's try and make this concrete with the issue of air pollution. We know that air pollution affects people's mental well-being much more than people themselves see to realize, and that is hence reflected in things like housing prices. But we do keep finding again and again in studies that it has a rather large effect, and hence that we should put in much more effort to clean up the air and, for instance, get rid of very polluting cars in very dense cities, which is something that people resist when it comes to their own car. But this, for me, is something that you can explain to people. You can, as it were, not just show them the data, but also make it plausible, right? Just comparing regions, telling them, asking them, well, what is it that they want from their grandchildren? And I do see it as important in that sense that what bureaucracies or governments decide for themselves on the basis of, the best science they want to follow, that is good, that they have to explain it and that they have to convince their public of it against critics who might say something else. So for me, the crucial step there is sort of, convincing, persuasion, open debate on these matters. Because there is always the argument that each of us only knows a tiny bit, and we have to take other people's expertise and opinions seriously. I mean, for instance, we have our food checked by food standards, and that is without most of us even knowing that it happens. Our food gets produced in ways we don't understand, and we trust that too. But we trust it for a reason. We haven't been cheated too much, and we think those systems have delivered in the past. So these are the normal ways in which a bureaucracy and a government has to, as it were, keep earning its trust, not betray the trust, and keep explaining its actions against critics and for the population.
Anybody else want to add on? Yeah, Michael.
But I agree, but I also think it's worth to keep things a bit in proportion here. And then I think historically there's been, I don't know, is it really that new? Is paternalism a much bigger problem threat because we are talking about using well-being in decision making relative to what we have been doing before or are doing? I'm not sure of that. And also, yeah, it's not like we advocates of well-being economy, wherever we are, whether we should call ourselves are in favor of the brave new world or something. Yeah, I think, yeah. So basically, I just wanted to say, I don't think it's that different, is it? Than what we're currently doing. There's always an element of paternalism in public decision making. It's not really changing that much with the level of well-being evaluations we want to that we are advocating for. I don't think that, at least.
Great. Yeah, I mean, there's this funny paradox almost with the life satisfaction approach, which is that it's leaving everything up to the individual as an expert on how they feel about their own life, and yet it doesn't presuppose that people actually know or would be likely to be correct about futures experiences they haven't had. In other words, what would make their life better? That's left to the the analysis of a lot of evidence. I don't know if any of you are into this kind of game, but if you are, and maybe you know the term "to steal man," can you advocate for the contrarians for a moment? Maybe to put some of the other hesitations or objections that people have on the table. But what are some reasons? Because if the story is that, well, this has a lot of promise, but we are actually a long way from getting there, both in terms of really permeating decision making and in terms of public understanding, acceptance, and so on, then there has to also be some caution about, if we're not there yet, we actually don't know everything about how it's going to go. So there's got to be some uncertainty. So what, maybe there's some uncertainty in your minds. Where could we actually, could this be misguided? But regardless, what the critics that you've heard say. So maybe you can articulate some of the objections.
Can I start on that one?
Please.
I would say if I can remember all three, three criticisms that come up that I find particularly hard to deal with. One is, even if you're the most sort of ardent sort of growth paradigm type person, you probably hold that view because you see the market mechanism and growth in GDP as the most efficient way to sort of improve living standards for the most people. And so probably your intentions and your motivation there are not nefarious, right? You would see yourself even in that, even as someone holding that philosophy, as someone who held it in service of the well-being of people. And you would be looking back on decades of human history where growth did deliver a lot of, improved living standards and lift people out of poverty. And so like, there is some merit to that argument that like, it's not that it's wrong, it's that it's unsustainable. And so like, there's this nuance that I think gets missed there. And then another is around adaptation. Like what I've noticed sort of working with policymakers is they get really suspicious about the extent to which adaptation is playing a role. And they don't want to they get really seized with this notion that people are adapting to circumstances that are actually not that good for them, and that we're losing this in the analysis, and sort of maybe our use of well-being evidence is actually sort of keeping people in less than ideal circumstances. And then I forgot what the third one was, so I'll stop there and then hopefully it will come to me later. But those are a couple that I think come up that I think those are fair criticisms, and I think at least interesting things to raise as we're having the conversation about what role or not sort of well-being evidence should play in policymaking.
Michael, did you want to jump in?
I also think so. At least one argument or counter, like a criticism I often encounter that I think is completely fair and something we really need to put up front in when advocating for well-being banks or well-being valuations or whatever. It is the like causal evidence, and obviously there's like the nature of willingness to pay analysis is that they just by definition are kind of causal because you ask people what they think something should be worth, right? And you don't really have to infer causality from that. Like it is just what it is. But with well-being valuations being WALY or WELLBY, you all of a sudden have like some causality to deal with that can be really, really tricky. So for instance, loneliness, like the evidence on loneliness interventions are just in general poor. And we really don't know how loneliness affects well-being or whether it's the other way around and how it all goes. Like, and I think but we do want it to be, we do want some loneliness values, like, so we just need to go with a route where we have to pick something, even though it's not perfectly, like empirically, it's not that good quality necessarily. And I think that is a fair argument, like that there is, like, we still lack a lot of good evidence on some levels, on some specific areas for well-being valuations where it's perhaps easier with the conventional methods.
Great. That was actually my next question, and partly to channel or paraphrase Elizabeth Dunn. Hi, Liz, who's asking about, and I see Paul is multitasking here, but asking about the replication crisis, and we have this database of evidence on life satisfaction, and as Michael, you just said, a lot of it doesn't fit the normally strict requirements of causal identification in economics. So how big an Achilles heel is that?
Should I?
Oh, sure. Anyone can jump in on that, or I can move on.
Well, Chris, I was multitasking because I was trying to answer those questions on the chat. So yeah, I was doing my best.
No, that's what I meant, is that you had already answered on the chat.
Yeah, exactly. But I did want to answer your previous question, which I find interesting, right? So what would be a major challenge to it? And for me, one of the most convincing major challenges is that both in families, individuals, governments, and society as a whole is, of course, a machine of decision-making that has been honed over many, many, many centuries. And there are all kinds of rules of thumbs in there that sort of have slipped in over the many centuries, which don't fit into the cost-benefit view at all. Just think of the rights system, think of the legal system, think of the notion of defense, right? These things are not, and in practical ways, cannot be based on cost-benefit analyses, but they're probably good things to do anyway. And so the question is, well, okay, how does cost-benefit analysis of any type, including well-being, fit alongside those, as it were, in long-term major rules of thumb, like freedom of speech, for instance, which I find very important, based on the belief that it's very good for life satisfaction. But geez, if you ask me to prove that, that will be a hell of a hassle, right? And so you have to have some notion of space for things which seem to have worked well for many centuries and are part of winning packages, even if you don't yet know how it's good for life satisfaction. And so there must be some humility that there clearly is stuff which is almost impossible to find out. And wisdom on that is packed into the institutions and in our habits already.
Okay, time is marching along, and there's some stuff I really want to get to. I want to deal with two things quickly. First of all, and this is getting back to the very basics, when you have a cost-benefit system, you are often evaluating benefits that come at different moments of time. Some of them are going to come in the future because of an investment or a expected outcome. Some of them come now, maybe as costs. How does each of these systems deal with time? Is it sort of the conventional way, or is there something new there?
Conventional.
Yeah, conventional.
Okay. Meaning that we discount time exponentially, and none of us sort of like that. It doesn't fit perfectly well behavioral evidence, but that is not a contribution of these methods to fix that in any way. Is that fair?
Yep.
Okay, now you've touched on this. Two of you touched on this in the introductions, but how do we deal with death, or the value of preventing a death? This concept of the value of a statistical life, which is very hard for people to get their heads around, and of course that's not something that this field has invented. But what are can we just be clear as succinctly as possible? How is that value of life handled, and is this an improvement? Maybe you can defend the approach.
Well, I'll go first. Effectively, every year of life lost that is in good health is 6 WELLBYs lost. And so that comes from the empirical regularity that good health people live at about an 8, and people close to indifferent are best estimated at the moment to be around a 2. So the statistical value of life in terms of a WELLBY is essentially rather simple. Now, in the statistical value of life, there are also other things that matter. How much production are we losing if particular individuals die? And that can be taken up in the methodology as well, but just in terms of valuing the person who is no more, rather than just what they bring to the rest of society, very simple. Every year of life they have less due to something is roughly 6 WELLBY, if otherwise they'd be in good health.
Yeah, and with the WALY approach, it's similar. However, we have actually done it originally different, and are actually looking into doing it in the WELLBY way, which means we're likely to put we think the evidence is quite clear that there should be a lower bound. So basically, what Paul is also saying is that there are states on the life satisfaction scale that is worse than death, right? So 0, 1. And of course, that cannot be part of the death value equation. So that needs to be taken out, which of course lowers the value of death. But as Paul said, you can then add all the economic and budgetary costs as well.
Whoops. Okay, I think I missed the last few words. Craig, do you want to add anything about how Canadian government values life?
No, I don't think I can.
There's I actually want to ask a question from Vidya, who is bringing up another one of the, I think, really important critiques or reservations people have hearing about this stuff, and especially in Canada, which is that these sound like awfully Western and settler and colonial kind of methods in many ways. So what can we say about suitably incorporating traditional wisdom, Indigenous knowledge about well-being, which seems to, in some sense, be ahead of the last few hundred years of Western economics and psychology, possibly, how is that to be represented and properly honored, but also reflected in our approach? That's
I go first,
rather big question, huh?
I go first. So, I mean, to be honest, I don't know what the Canadian Indigenous people had in their minds as to what was important for them. But in terms of the description that was just sent around, right, so hope, purpose, meaning, and belonging, well, that's pretty much life satisfaction. You know, correlates so strongly, you might as well call them almost the same. So if that is truly it, then to a certain extent, this well-being approach goes back to how they thought about it. But on a deeper level, this life satisfaction, happiness element it has been attractive to me in my life intellectually, because it's kind of a long-run attractor of human societies. You know, it's been around in Greek times, and then again in Italian state times, and you see it in Eastern philosophies. So it gets overblown in historical events. You know, the life of the emperor starts to be more important, or some sort of temporary fear or ideology takes over. But it's sort of the story we return to as humans, and that makes me like it, right? And so I'm not surprised that the Indigenous people of Canada seem to have hit upon a similar idea, really. It's sort of the thing we humans come back to as well. This is really what we want for our grandchildren, no matter whom we are. But we can get blown, of course, and find something else important for a generation or two. But that's, yeah, sounds like good news if what she says is true.
Michael?
Yeah, and also just to add, like, I think it's important to emphasize that life satisfaction valuations is not the end of things. Like, we have not settled with this method. It's just important to not make perfect the enemy of the good. And what life satisfaction does is it improves a lot of these valuations, at least in my view. But we can create WALYs and WELLBYs because there just happens to be a lot of good evidence already. But these things need to be improved also over time, and I'm certain that at one point we will also probably use another instrument than life satisfaction in the WALY or WELLBY analysis, as it's not necessarily settled with that metric, and it should, by design, and that's my view, like whenever we design like a well-being bank or a database of coefficients and so on like that, should by design also be open to other valuation methods or well-being valuation methods, because we, of course, will get more clever and smarter about these things, and think more holistic. But it is the least worst metric, in my view, life satisfaction.
Greg?
Yeah, I think as a concept, I probably agree with something Paul said, that there is something universal about this that speaks to you, whoever you are, that as humans, we have certain things that determine our well-being. And one of the things that I find well-being evidence does really well is it really emphasizes the importance of the local. A lot of our well-being is determined locally, and a lot of it is determined socially in our interactions with one another. And so if you get those two things right, you're probably going to have a high level of well-being. And it seems to me that sort of across many Indigenous cultural traditions, those are things that are sort of highly valued and have never really been lost by those groups. And so I kind of feel like as colonizers and settler sort of folk, we're rediscovering kind of what has been known by a lot of people who have lived Indigenous traditional lifestyles kind of all along. So I don't think that this sort of like Western science sort of track that we're on, because that kind of is what it is necessarily inconsistent with sort of what we might hear from Indigenous people if we were to sort of engage more on this, which we do need to do. I know in Canada we haven't had as much sort of consultation on the Indigenous side of things as we might like, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Okay, at this point, I have to make a tough decision, because one thing I really want to talk about, I'm going to have you all back to spend an hour on, which is that you all said you thought, let me add a word, human well-being should be the primary goal of government. And so that's another thing that a lot of people have an objection to when humans are currently messing up the planet for others. And so the question, which I'm sorry, I'm going to put it out there as an advertisement maybe to our audience to come to look for further webinars on this topic is, what's the relationship between this kind of well-being approach and sustainability? I'm sorry, I'm parking that because I want to give you each a chance for a final word and to end on time. So if there's any final thoughts, and maybe they can briefly touch on that question if you like, but if you have your any final thoughts that haven't come up, or that you would the way that you would articulate the value of this approach and learning, investing in these kind of decision-making tools and evaluation tools, how would that go?
I don't know if I have a thought that kind of sums up anything, but one other topic that we didn't really talk about was the notion of inequality and well-being inequality, and how we could think about that, because I think that's another important dimension that we kind of skipped over, but there's probably lots that could be said in a future panel about that.
Thank you. Definitely. Anybody else?
I'll have a final thought to share. Yes, I mean, as Craig and Michael have said, and also some people in the chat have said, it is indeed the local and social connections. And so if you are really cognizant of that, you've got that, in every vein of your brain, then of course you will be very suspicious of policies which keep people apart, which tell them they can't see loved ones, even if it's for supposedly some sort of good threat, which makes it very difficult for people to meet each other, which disrupts seeing each other when they're dying, which disrupts normal school behaviors as your kids can see each other. And so from the world of well-being, you will quickly see the lockdowns and the social diktats of the last 2.5 years as tremendous destroyers of well-being. And you do see that around the world. And I will even say that if you're serious about well-being, it's incredibly hard to be in favor of that.
Michael, you get the last word if you like.
Yeah, I think there's been said so many great things, and perhaps what I think is just important, I hope people take away from this, even though there may be a few disagreements in the panel, we are still, I think, one family of well-being advocates who see the benefit of this. And I think what is really important also for the critics and people who are a bit hesitant, because I meet that a lot when talking with social enterprises, NGOs, so in Denmark, and policymakers, and it is to kind of remember what is status quo. We don't offer the perfect solution, but there are some bugs with the current way of doing things, and so I think we always need to have that in mind, and make the comparison of whether is this just are we improving things with WELLBY or WALY relative to willingness to pay and so on. And I think we really are. We can then actually start putting at least some value to some of these social aspects of life, and as Craig said, prevention and all of these things will start to appear as more valuable. And I think that just makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. So even though the metrics and the technical things can be a bit strange to some, I think it's worth to be mindful that this is a strange field. There is a lot of weird things with cost benefit analysis, and it's definitely not perfect. We are making a lot of assumptions, and but it needs to be done.
Great place to end. Thank you so much again for your time. I hope we can do this again. The CWKN doesn't have any other webinars on its calendar yet, but we are planning a bunch, so please stay tuned. And to everybody who came to join us today, thank you so much. Bye-bye.